Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. So today we are going to be discussing Bjorn and Rhiannon's backstory. I wrote this back over the summer and was meaning to have a full speed paint accompanying it, but I've been working on a couple of other big writing projects that have been eating up so much of my time, and a ridiculous amount of time passed between writing this and putting it up, so I'm just gonna put up part of the speed paint, well, more so a speed sketch with it, even though I kind of already put this up. It's better than having nothing happening in the background, so don't mind that. It looks a little bit weird because it's just the sketch of the characters. There's no background or magical effects, so they're kind of just awkwardly posing in space, but it's fine. We're at the point in our Skyrim series where I'd like to go ahead and put this up, so that's what we're doing today. Oh, one other thing before we do begin. This probably does conflict with Gonair's backstory video. That is because I have, of course, once again made changes. I'm trying to go ahead and finalize all of the stories now for one of those big projects that I'm working on. So I'm actually needing to redo Gonair and Teldrin's backstory videos, but that may take a little bit. This is the new canon. And of course, I hope you enjoy. Rhiannon Volkov was born on the 4th of Frostfall, 4th Era 168. And her brother, Bjorn, on the 17th of Sunsdawn, 4th Era 170. Their parents, Maeva and Geirmund, were agents of the Blades who had married and settled in Maeva's home of Falkreath to raise their family. Not long after Bjorn's birth, the Great War began, and their parents, bound to their duties as Blades, somberly left for Cyrodiil. Rhiannon and Bjorn were left under the care of their grandfather, Lodin, until the war ended in 4th Era 175. Only Maeva returned. Geirmund had fallen in battle with the elves, leaving Maeva bitter, paranoid, and secretive. She decided to try to lay low and tend to her family in hopes that they were secluded enough in the woods and mountains of Falkreath Hold, in hopes that they would be safe. The former Blade was not often open with her children, who had grown much closer to their grandfather in her absence, but tried her best to settle back down into a more homely life. She put away her sword and armor and began helping her father run his shop, Grey Pine Goods. Despite the gloom that lingered over the woods they called home, and that likewise stuck with their mother, Bjorn and Rhiannon had happy childhoods. Rhiannon was loud, mischievous, and playful, if not often blunt and sarcastic. Beloved by many in the town, she was quick to make friends, but she was also known for her quick temper. She wasn't afraid to fully state how she was feeling, and was often the leader of her brother and their friends, occasionally leading them into less than favorable situations. She usually spent the days with her friends or exploring around the town. She was a natural with a bow, learning the basics from her mother, and refining her skill later while out hunting with her friends Morwen and Ari. She and Bjorn shared a love of reading, bonding over stories of adventures and great heroes. However, Bjorn, the gentler of the two, read just about anything he could. From fantastical fiction to historic accounts to flowing poems, he loved it all, and could usually be found in a secluded spot reading whatever book he could find. If not, he would no doubt be singing and baking with his mother, or trying to learn spellcasting from his grandfather. His love of comfort and luxury often conflicted with his dreams of traveling, to write songs of his adventures and share them in his rest. Bjorn was fascinated by tales of his warrior father, and began idolizing Geirmund's talent with the lute in particular. However, a young boy trying to teach himself to play an instrument on his own wasn't able to get very far. Eventually, the local priest Runil took notes of Bjorn's attempts and offered to teach him what he knew. Maeva scolded Bjorn for pestering the old priest, but in actuality was suspicious of the Altmer, who had arrived in Falkreath not long after she had returned from the war. But Bjorn continued to learn from the elf, and became more interested in religion through him, favoring Mara and Arcane in particular. As the two neared their teenage years, their grandfather Lodin began to emphasize the arcane arts more in their teachings. Though quiet about his abilities with people outside of his family, the Nord had studied at the College of Winterhold for some time, and hoped to pass down the usefulness of the arcane to his grandchildren, where his daughter had not been very interested. Rhiannon proved to be a bit too impatient to get very far for a long while with spellcasting, but eventually Bjorn began to pick up on some of his teachings, though his magic was weak and unstable. With her tendency to make all things into competition, Rhiannon began to take the lessons to heart, and finally began to find success in conjuration. The interest was at least there now for the two siblings to encourage Lodin to keep trying. During one particularly cold morning star, the siblings went to Lake Ilinalta to camp, so Rhiannon could hunt, Bjorn could have his beloved peace and quiet, and so that they could skate together on the frozen lake. However, they misjudged the depth of the freeze, and while skating, Bjorn ventured onto too thin ice. He broke through into the deathly waters below, but managed to swim upwards and grab onto the ice. The camp was not far, and Rhiannon managed to run back and retrieve rope to aid her brother and get him to the campfire. Afterwards, the memory of the harsh chill of the frozen depths seemed to attune Bjorn's abilities to frost-based destruction spells. He found more success with magic, despite his newfound fear of the ice and water. Once he was more successfully able to cast destruction spells, he moved on to study restoration, sometimes seeking Runel's aid, and onto Lodin's personal expertise, illusion magic. When they were late into their teenage years, their mother became increasingly irritable and apprehensive, but never offered any insight as to why, though one evening, Rhiannon did hear Maeve speak briefly to Lodin about her potentially leaving Falkreath soon. Then, in the late hours, came a knock at the door, accompanied by elven voices. Maeve hurriedly had the two teenagers grab some of their belongings, while Lodin approached the door, telling the guests that the store was closed. Bjorn and Rhiannon had no idea what was happening, but in a panic, they and Maeve ran out through the second-level door and into the woods as Lodin began attacking the Thalmor to allow for their escape, though the old mage was greatly outnumbered and doomed. The three ran eastward through the night, Maeve trying her best to explain to her children what was happening, as she had kept much of her and her husband's past with the blades from them, believing it to be for their own good. They eventually made it to Riften and shortly after moved into Honeyside. There, Rhiannon secretly became mildly involved with the Thieves Guild, though Maeve certainly had some dealings of her own with them. Rhiannon felt she had a place in the questionable city. Bjorn, on the other hand, absolutely despised it, still in shock from having to flee his old home. The young Nord preferred to be out of the city walls whenever he could, admiring the plentiful beauty that could be found on the lake or amongst the trees. But their time in Riften didn't last long. After a couple of years had passed, the Thalmor caught up to them, but this time Maeve knew they were coming before they reached the city and had a plan. To go to a place where the Thalmor allegedly had no influence, Vvardenfell. Maeve by this point had it all figured out, and had already prepared papers with false identification to cross the border, and a home for them where they could open up shop when they arrived on the grief-stricken island in the reconstruction town of Ebonheart. The housing had become especially cheap there, which caused her to bless her good fortunes. She was not happy when the first person to greet them as they arrived was an Altmer. As they were moving in and getting ready to open up a shop, a young Dunmer came by to greet the newcomers. His name was Gonair, grandson of the Reconstruction's founder, who currently lived with his mentor, the Altmer Adamo. It was clear the Dunmer was fascinated by the foreigners, as he often came by or made a point to talk to them if they happened to visit the Corner Club. Rhiannon and Gonair were fast friends, but Bjorn, as usual, was more reserved for quite some time. Months after they had arrived, Bjorn began performing in the Corner Club in the evenings, where he certainly couldn't avoid conversation with the persistent elf. Eventually, he developed a fondness for their conversations, and the siblings in the Mer became close friends. Maeve was terribly paranoid about her children being around the house of an Altmer, but through Gonair's charisma and Adamo's polite gestures, a cautious acceptance was ultimately reached. Things were relatively calm for some time afterwards, as calm as they can be living on Vvardenfell post-Red Year, of course. About a year after arriving in Vvardenfell, a relationship formed between Bjorn and Gonair. Meanwhile, Rhiannon, at first with Gonair as her guide, began venturing out into the ash wastes for exploration and hunting, and had fairly good fortune despite all the dangers outside of the walls. All was well until Adamo, in an act of his usual clumsiness, failed to properly dispose of a letter, which just so happened to fall in the hands of ever-curious and keen Rhiannon. The letter was addressed to Adamo from his father, and mentioned the young Altmer's duty to the Thalmor. Rhiannon immediately revealed the letter to Bjorn and Gonair, to the former's horror and the latter's confusion. The Dunmer didn't understand their panic, not quite fully understanding what the Thalmor really were, or on the events of the Great War, and denied that Adamo could ever mean any of them harm. The Nords weren't so convinced, and tensions were high between them and the Mer. Though he from this point avoided Adamo's house, Bjorn continued to see Gonair despite his family's disapproval, and tried to convince Gonair of the threat Adamo posed, but not to much effect. Maeve and Rhiannon soon after left for the nearby town of Balmora, but Bjorn refused to follow, as he hoped Gonair was right in his trust of the Altmer. He and Gonair moved in together in the house the women had left behind, and Maeve and Rhiannon went back to business and opened up shop in Balmora, where they were pleased to learn housed no high elves. One sleepy, rainy evening, spent lounging by the hearth, Bjorn and Gonair began to feel the house, no, the whole earth, tremor. Not thinking much of it, as small earthquakes were a common occurrence in Vvardenfell, the two continued to relax until they began to hear screaming and the sound of water crashing. They rushed outside to find tides of the scathing bay towering in ripples over the outer embankment, rushing over and into the carapace-styled structures, decimating yurts and pummeling into the taller buildings, threatening windows and stone alike. In a near incoherent fit of panic, Gonair, grabbing his sword, began yelling about an Argonian attack and rushed off in the direction of Adamo's home. Bjorn shouted at him to stop, that they needed to evacuate the walled-in town that was fast becoming a bowl for the scathing bay's wretched waters. but the maddened Mer wouldn't listen. Bjorn took up pursuit and saw as a receding wave swept Gonir off his feet and pulled him and debris into the tunnels of one of the crab-shaped Redoran homes. The Nord dove into the scalding waters and into the tunnel to find his beloved netted up in the remaining scraps of a yurt. Seeing the Mer's sword, gleaming bright and angrily from its enchantment, had sunk into one of the house's hallways, Bjorn swam desperately towards it. He quickly returned to his writhing lover and slashed him free, and the two escaped the tunnels and managed to flee town. What few refugees that had survived made their way north, to Balmora, where Bjorn and Gonir were reunited with Maeva and Rhiannon. The Altmer had not made it out with them, so Maeva allowed the battered and weary pair to move out into their newfound, but rather small home. Balmora had already been struggling with overcrowded conditions making their food shortage all the more harsh, and the women hadn't had much luck running their shop. Bjorn and Gonir tried their best to help out, with Bjorn once again turning to performing at the corner club, and Gonir helping out around the local alchemy shop, but the family still faced hardships. Rhiannon occasionally resorted to thievery, under the guise that she had just found whatever she had picked while out exploring the ashways. None of the others questioned her occasional good luck much. 10 years after the two lovers had met, Bjorn felt it was time to advance their relationship. He was 31, and felt that if he and Gonir did not wed soon, they likely never would. He and Rhiannon planned to venture out by Gwar to seek out Gonir's familial tomb, so that Bjorn could attempt to gain approval from the Dunmer's ancestors. The two snuck away as Gonir was working and hurriedly made their way south towards the old ruined town. The elf had once brought the pair to the tomb, so fortunately it was not too difficult for them to find. Rhiannon waited as Bjorn went inside to commune. He brought offerings of incense, wine, and a family dagger that Maeva had given to him. 3 ghostly forms appeared before them as he called out, and to his surprise, the approval was not difficult to get. He thanked the spirits, and the 2 Nords rushed off, trying to beat the sunset home. Later that month, after acquiring a suitable gift and planning the situation out, Bjorn took Gonir to the banks of the Odai for one of the pastimes that the Nord had enjoyed most in his homeland, to sit, picnic, and paint together in the company of nature. This was, however, Vvardenfell, so the troublesome ash was ever a problem, not to mention the lurking dangers, but the two tried to make the best of it. But then, as the Nord began to propose, the Mer froze up. Bjorn thought perhaps it was just nerves and kept going, until Gonir began apologizing. He claimed he believed himself too young and not ready for that sort of thing, and that he needed more time to consider it, but that was only part of the truth. The Dunmer was terrified of outliving the man, and had recently been having second thoughts on the relationship as a whole, with no idea of what to do or how to confess his fears. Bjorn was devastated, but with his usual patient demeanor, tried to understand and not be upset with the elf. They continued their relationship, but things were certainly rocky. Rhiannon, though, with her usual temper, was furious when she learned what had happened, and acted quite harshly towards the young Mer afterwards. As the year turned to 4th Era 201, Maeve announced to the others that she planned to soon depart from Vvardenfell, that she hoped everyone, at least her children, would do the same. The terrible conditions on the island, she believed, and was probably correct, were making the 3 Nords become ill, and had not felt safe in the Thalmor since the ordeal with the Damo. She had decided she would leave for Hammerfell, but suggested so long as her children dropped their family name, they would surely be safer away from her in Skyrim. The 2 younger Nords surely missed their homeland, and Bjorn especially desired living in more peaceful and appealing conditions. And though they knew that they would greatly miss their mother, it was decided that they'd prefer to not trade one dusty, hot landscape for another. Gonir seemed conflicted at first, but ultimately wanted to go with the Nords, especially after Bjorn convinced him they could attend the College of Winterhold together before perhaps settling down in the beautiful hold of Falkreath. After months of preparation, they left for the mainland. Finding passage across the inner sea wasn't easy, and the roads once they arrived certainly had their fill of troubles as well, but at first things went smoothly enough. Halfway between the inner sea and the borders of Skyrim, as the women were setting up camp and Bjorn was preparing their supper, Gonir decided he would do a short venture around the area of the campsite to seek out alchemical reagents, and ensure that they would be safe in the night. By sunset, he had not returned, and the stirring winds of an oncoming storm had begun to create an ashy haze around the campsite, much to the concern of the Nords. They set out to try to find the elf, calling loudly to him, but there was no response. As they were heading back to the camp in hopes that the rain would soon come and dampen down the ash for them to continue their search, Rhiannon spotted a trickle of blood, some singed leaves, and a cagooti print in the ash. The 3 hastened in the directions of the tracks, fearing the elf injured or dead, but now their calls were finally heeded. Unfortunately, not by the Mer they sought, but by a group of mercenaries. Thinking they were just other travelers, the 3 called out to them, asking if they had seen the young Dunmer. They were not prepared when the group brandished weapons and attacked them. They were beaten and bound, and in between spells of unconsciousness, began to hear the voices of a pair of high elves. They were dragged to the nearby road and loaded onto covered carts, Maeva was separated from Bjorn and Rhiannon and unable to do anything to stop it. It didn't take Maeva long to know what had happened and where they were being taken, and she was glad she had always remained secretive with her children, at least so the Thalmor couldn't beat any useful information out of them. As she had expected, they arrived at the embassy in Skyrim. Rhiannon and Bjorn were thrown into cells, but had no idea what the Thalmor had done with their mother. They didn't even have an idea of how much time had passed, but days on end were agonizingly spent in chains or being tortured and questioned. But the two Nords had no answers for the elves, so back to their cells they would go, wrists strapped to the walls, time passing slowly day after day. Until Maeva managed to sneak into one of their cells, freeing each of her children and motioning to them in frantic silence. They were all terribly weak from the treatment handed to them by the elves, but they managed to slip into an unguarded passageway and make their ways to the chilly night air beyond. Maeva hastily explained that she had taken the Thalmor's records of them and a few of their belongings, and was now going to attempt to get the elves on her trail, so that the other two would be able to slip away unnoticed. She hoped that the Thalmor had concluded the younger Nords truly didn't have any answers for them, and wouldn't want to waste the resources chasing after them anyway, but she wanted to be sure they could run free. She gave them both a tight hug and told them to flee east, but to avoid the roads and major cities until they made it at least out of Hjalmarch. They surely wouldn't be pursued beyond there. Bjorn and Rhiannon ran until the last of their strength gave out. Luckily, the summer offered some respite from the deadly chill of northern Skyrim, so the two were able to make it through the night without any equipment. When they awoke, they were terribly hungry, but were forced to keep going despite the lack of strength to capably do so. They trudged on, eventually managing to find and hunt some food, but not feeling much better afterwards. One evening, as the sky threatened to rain on them, which would certainly lead to a miserable night in the cold swamps of Hjalmarch, they saw in the distance a humble wooden shack. Hoping it was abandoned, or at least accompanied by a hospitable host, they made their way to it. Bjorn knocked on the door, which soon creaked open, an older woman peering out at them. They pleaded with her for food and shelter for the night, and with a smile, the woman obliged. But the two Nords were not comforted. The inside of the shack was cold and hollow, with seemingly no food in sight. The woman chatted with the nervous pair as she began to light the hearth, but as she did, Rhiannon began to feel a strange dullness come over her. Then suddenly the woman lashed out to grab Bjorn's neck, her surprising strength overwhelming him as he thrashed to get away. The woman commanded Rhiannon to strike down her prey, and only semi-aware of her actions, the Nord complied. She lifted up a decrepit old pan and struck her brother in the back of the head. The old woman cackled and bit into Bjorn's neck as his vision began to fade. Rhiannon stood still, watching, completely overtaken by the vampire's spell. When she had finished her supper, the vampire ordered her new thrall to take out the remains, and Rhiannon stoically obeyed. She carried her brother out into the dark marsh, tossing him away into the murky water before returning to the shack. But the jolt of hitting the cold water awakened the man, still barely clinging to life. As the icy depths had learned to empower him, he once again desperately called forth his magic, trying to mend his wounds. It was enough to stabilize him and allow him to pull himself out of the water, but the vertigo and the fatigue didn't allow him to get very far. He collapsed into the cold, wet mud. The sun on his face awoke him, blazing into his eyes even through clouds as he dared to open them. He mustered the strength to stand and deliriously began to wonder, healing himself any time he could manage to, but to not much effect. He was starving. By a small flicker of luck, in the distance he saw humanoid forms crossing through the marsh. As he got closer, he noticed their tails and ears, and figured they must be a Khajiit caravan, and cried out to them for help. But instead of being truthful with them, and fear of being turned away if they knew he had been attacked by a vampire, he told the Khajiit he had been mugged and left for dead by bandits. The caravan allowed him to come along, so long as when they arrived in Solitude he would go into the city to trade some of their wares for them. He agreed, and they set up camp early for the day, letting the Nord rest and tend to his wounds, and offered him food and drink, which he graciously accepted. However, as he ate, no amount of food could seem to satiate him. A pit grew in his stomach, and though he tried to tell himself he was simply famished from the abuse of the Thalmor and from the long days afterwards, he couldn't fool himself. His only hope was that they would soon arrive in Solitude so he could find a priest, but there was not enough time. The next night, only a short distance more to the city, as they had begun to drift off to sleep, a terrible, maddening hunger awoke Bjorn. The thump of the 3 Khajiit hearts were calling out to the frenzied Nord, and he couldn't resist. In a feral fit of rage, he lunged at the lead Khajiit, biting into the poor cat's neck. The Khajiit awoke with a scream, alerting the 2 caravan guards, who quickly brandished their weapons and struck at the newly turned vampire. Only then had Bjorn realized what he had done, and while only taking a minor hit to the arm, managed to run off and disappear into the night. Rhiannon had completely lost herself. Her days were spent doing the vampire's bidding, which usually involved wandering the lands nearby in the day to seek out any travelers the old hag could use as her next meal. As she wandered one evening, she heard 2 Nordic voices nearby and sought them out. She expected a couple of travelers, but what she found instead were 2 Stormcloak scouts, who were already aware of her watching them. They issued a warning as she approached, but seeing the glazed look in her eyes, one of the scouts saw her for what she was. One of them quickly grabbed her while the other began punching her until she came to and pleaded with them to yield. They quickly ceased, though she was still grappled until well after she had begun to explain her situation involving the vampire and the death of her brother. The scouts believed her, as there had been numerous vampire sightings in the area, and offered her sanctuary in their camp, so that perhaps when she was ready, they could seek out this vampire and seek vengeance. And, of course, rid the world of yet another vampire. She eagerly accepted and returned back with them. There she was told more of what had happened to her, including the events of the Thalmor, to which the Stormcloaks were quite sympathetic and outraged. She took a quick liking to them, and though they never managed to locate the vampire's shack, as Rhiannon's memory was quite fuzzy from being enthralled, she decided to travel with one of the soldiers back to Windhelm, and officially joined the ranks of the Stormcloaks. After that dreadful night he had turned, feeling rejuvenated though terribly disgusted with himself. Bjorn returned to the shack to try and find any traces of his sister. Inside he found only the vampire, and decided to take a chance at confronting her. Immediately upon opening the door, he pelted her with his magical frost, slowing her movement. Then he pinned her, with newly grown claws puncturing into her flesh. He demanded to know where Rhiannon was, at which the hag simply laughed, saying she had obviously underestimated the Nord woman's abilities, as she had quickly disappeared after becoming her thrall, and simply had to be dead. Enraged and spotting his old axe nearby, Bjorn stomped on the old vampire's leg, causing the thing to writhe as he went for his axe, and brought it to her head, quickly ending the vampire's unlife. Bjorn grabbed the rest of his belongings and left, heading into the night to learn and cope with his new form. First he found himself near Stonehills, where he watched the miners and waited for an opportunity to feed. Eventually he found one had wandered away from the settlement, and Bjorn pursued. Not trying to harm the man, he jumped up to him and quickly sank his teeth into the unsuspecting Nord's neck, but the miner let out a shriek. Bjorn struck and silenced him, but he knew he didn't have long until the other miners would come to investigate. He hurriedly drank as much as he could before lying the man down and healing his wounds, and once again ran off into the night. He first left for Falkreath, hoping to at least get a glimpse of his old home, but there he became too frightened he would hurt an old friend, so he wandered off again. On the roads, he became more confident in his abilities, using his musical talent and skills with magical charms to lure away his victims, before feeding and afterwise healing them, trying to leave them in a comfortable enough place to ease the lingering guilt he still felt. Eventually, Bjorn became more comfortable with his powers and ability to blend in, and decided to stay in Rorikstead for some time to even better work on assimilating back into society. He began to perform at the Frostfruit Inn in exchange for a room, and when he needed a feed, would simply charm away a villager, who afterwards would have no memory of what had happened to them. The following spring, as thunderstorms hid the sun away beneath a thick blanket of cloud, Bjorn took the opportunity to wander the countryside around Rorikstead, always appreciating even the gloomiest of weather. But as he hiked, he saw in the distance a great pillar of twisting, colorful energies, a great dark dragon flying before it. Horrified after hearing the rumors of the destruction of Helgen, a small town a good bit bigger than Rorikstead, he decided he had assimilated well enough to leave for a bigger, preferably walled city. After being told for so long that he should attend the Bard's College in solitude to make more of a name for himself, he decided to head up north, though he was welcomed into the college and offered them aid on multiple occasions. He was never allowed full membership, as it was tradition to be initiated only during a festival which had been called off by the Jarl. Frustrated, after he heard about the death of the great dragon Alduin, he decided to once again venture off, to experience his own adventures and tales to sing of. After the Stormcloaks' attack on Whiterun, their leader, Ulfric Stormcloak, had eyes set on Falkreath. Once again reunited with her hometown after its liberation, Rhiannon decided to linger for some time afterwards, to satisfy her nostalgia. There, she found an unexpected friend. As she walked from the inn to the forest one afternoon, she heard a familiar accented voice calling her name. She turned and found already upon her was the lost and presumed dead Dunmer on air. The two couldn't believe their eyes, but the reunion was not merry for long. After learning the fate of Bjorn, the Dunmer was devastated, which quickly formed into outrage. The Mer sworn then and there to avenge his lost lover, and being already informed on the growing vampire threat in Skyrim, knew where he wanted to turn. He offered Rhiannon to join him in seeking out the Dawnguard, to hunt and slay any vampire that could have been the one to hurt the two Nords. She quickly agreed. She had begun to doubt her decision in joining the Stormcloaks. Once viewing them as a way to strike back at the Thalmor, she now feared that the whole civil war actually benefited the malevolent elves. So after gathering some allies to accompany them, the group headed off to the Rift to find this order of vampire hunters. Bjorn, lounging in the city of Markarth in between his travels, heard rumor that the festival at the Bard's College was back on, and though he had not returned to it for some time, decided to head off and see the supposed splendor of the festivities. The journey was much quicker due to his new horse Amdis, and he made it to Solitude in time for the festival. As the headmaster began his speech, Bjorn approached to watch the burning of the effigy, but his eyes were led instead to the dumber man standing next to the torchbearer. He doubted his eyes at first, but then the headmaster proclaimed the savior of the festival to be the Dragonborn, Gonair, Bjorn's long-lost beloved. He couldn't believe it, and couldn't find the words to say as he approached the Mer, who was equally in shock when he saw Bjorn before him. The two spent the remainder of the festival trying their best to explain what had happened to each other in Vvardenfell, their travels and misfortunes afterwards, and how the party had paused in their adventures to aid the Bard's College in tribute to Bjorn. As the festival lights began to go out, the two left for the inn so that Gonair could reunite Bjorn and Rhiannon once again. And from that point you guys are watching the story, so I don't think I need to continue. Once again, sorry if it's not the most beautifully written, and especially I feel like this one's feels a little kind of rushed in some places, but I'm trying to fit a lot of information into one little video. So yeah, once again, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'm so excited that I finally got to talk about Bjorn and Rhiannon because I have been working on them for almost a year and a half now, at least of redesigning them. I have had them as characters for much longer than that, but yeah, hopefully soon enough I'll have up more story videos. Like I said, I'm trying to finalize everything just for the big project I'm working on, and also so hopefully eventually we can move on to our Elder Scrolls 6 character and have a solid basis to build them up on. But yeah, if you enjoyed this, don't forget to leave it a like, maybe consider supporting my Ko-fi or Patreon if you want to help out the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye bye!